Dylan stopped mid-song. He stepped back from the microphone. And he stared at something in the crowd that no one else had noticed. The venue was small. A theater in upstate New York. November 1978. Maybe 400 people packed into worn velvet seats, the kind of place that smelled like old wood and cigarette smoke even when no one was smoking. Dylan had been touring for months. The same songs. Different crowds. Different towns that all looked the same in the dark. He was 47 years old and tired in a way that sleep couldn't fix. He was 3 verses into Tangled Up in Blue when it happened. His voice, that distinctive rasp that had carried a generation's anger and hope and confusion, simply stopped. Not a dramatic stop. Not a forgot the word stop. Just stopped. He took one step backward from the microphone. His hands stayed on his guitar, but they weren't playing anymore. His eyes, hidden partly by the stage lights and the shadows they made on his face, had locked onto something in the 7th row. The band kept playing for maybe 2 more measures before they noticed. The bass player looked up. The drummer's rhythm faltered. One by one, the music died. 400 people sat in sudden silence, unsure if this was part of the show or if something had gone wrong. Dylan didn't move. Didn't speak. Just stood there, one step back from the microphone, staring into the crowd. Dylan didn't explain himself. He never did. In the 7th row, center section, sat a man in his late 60s. Gray hair. Worn canvas jacket. Hands folded in his lap. He wasn't reacting to Dylan's sudden stop. He was just there. Waiting. Like he'd been waiting for a long time. The people around him were whispering. Someone in the front row turned around, trying to see what Dylan was looking at. The stage lights made it hard to see into the audience, but Dylan's focus was absolute. Unmistakable. The man in the 7th row slowly raised one hand. Not a wave. Just a raising. An acknowledgement. Dylan saw it. Everyone saw Dylan see it. And then, without a word to the band or the audience, Dylan set his guitar down on its stand. Carefully. Deliberately. He stepped to the edge of the stage, past the monitor speakers, past the cables and the lights, and he sat down. Right there on the stage edge, his legs dangling over the side like a kid on a dock. The theater held its breath. To understand what happened next, you need to understand what happened in 1961. Bob Dylan wasn't Bob Dylan yet. He was Robert Zimmerman, 20 years old, fresh off a bus from Minnesota to New York City with a guitar, a harmonica, and a head full of Woody Guthrie songs. He had maybe $40 in his pocket, and nowhere specific to sleep. Greenwich Village in 1961 was where folk music lived and died and lived again every night in basement clubs and coffee houses. If you could play and you could sing and you had something to say, you could get on a stage. If you were good, you could pass the hat and make enough for a sandwich and a place to crash. Dylan played everywhere those first months. The Gaslight. Gerd's Folk City. Café Wa? Anywhere that would let him. He was raw. Rough. His voice wasn't pretty and his guitar playing was workmanlike at best. But there was something in the way he delivered a song, like he meant every word even when the words weren't his, that made people stop talking and listen. One night in February, Dylan was playing a Tuesday open mic at a place that doesn't exist anymore. Tiny room. Maybe 30 people. He played 4 songs to polite applause and was about to play his 5th when a man walked in. Late 50s. Working class clothes. The kind of hands that had done real labor for real years. He ordered a coffee, sat in the back, and listened. Dylan finished his set. Passed the hat. Made enough for dinner. He was packing up his guitar when the man approached. "You play Guthrie?" the man asked. "Yeah," Dylan said. "You like Guthrie?" "I knew Guthrie," the man said simply. That got Dylan's attention. Woody Guthrie was Dylan's hero. The whole reason he'd come to New York. The voice of the Dust Bowl, the working man, the dispossessed. Dylan had visited Guthrie in the hospital where he was slowly dying from Huntington's disease. had played songs for him, had absorbed everything about how Guthrie turned life into music. You knew him? Dylan asked. Rode the rails with him in 37, the man said. Before he was famous. Before anybody knew his name. We were just riding. Looking for work. He had that beat-up guitar and he'd play for anybody who'd listen. Didn't matter if it was 5 hobos around a fire or nobody at all. He played. The man's name was Frank Holloway. He'd been a railroad worker, a farmhand, a construction laborer. He'd lived the life that Guthrie sang about. He'd seen the Dust Bowl. He'd ridden the freight trains. He'd stood in bread lines. They talked for 2 hours in that empty cafe. Frank told stories. Dylan listened like his life depended on it. About Woody. About the songs that came from real desperation and real hope. About the difference between singing about the world and living in it. Kid, Frank said as they were leaving, you got something. I can hear it. But don't ever forget, these songs aren't about you. They're about the people who can't sing for themselves. Dylan never forgot that conversation. It shaped everything that came after. When he wrote, Blowin' in the Wind, the next year, he thought about Frank. When he wrote, The Times They Are A-Changin', he thought about the railroad workers and farmhands. When he went electric and half the folk world called him a traitor, he thought about what Frank had said, the songs aren't about you. Frank had given Dylan an address that night. A rooming house in the Bronx. If you ever need a place to crash or just want to talk about the real world, come find me. Dylan went there twice. Once in 1962, after his first album came out. Frank had listened to it on a borrowed record player and told Dylan, You're getting there. Keep going. The second time was 1964, right before everything exploded. Before Newport. Before the world decided Bob Dylan was the voice of a generation whether he wanted to be or not. Frank had looked at him with concern. This thing that's happening to you, this fame thing, it's gonna try to kill who you are. Don't let it. Dylan had promised he wouldn't. He wasn't sure he'd kept that promise. After 64, Dylan lost track of Frank. The world got too big. The tours. The records. The motorcycle accident. The retreat. The comeback. The endless cycle of being Bob Dylan, which felt less and less like being himself. He'd thought about Frank over the years. Wondered if he was still alive. Wondered if he'd kept the same address. Wondered if Frank would even recognize the person Dylan had become, the voice of a generation who felt more like a ventriloquist's dummy than a voice. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most important part of this story is still unfolding. Sitting on the edge of the stage in that upstate New York theater, Dylan looked at the man in the 7th row. Frank? His voice carried through the silent theater without a microphone. The man nodded slowly. Hello, Bob. The audience was completely lost. They didn't know who this man was. They didn't know why Bob Dylan had stopped a song and was now sitting on the stage talking to some old guy in a canvas jacket. I didn't know if you'd still. Dylan started, then stopped. Started again. How long has it been? 14 years, Frank said. His voice was quieter than Dylan's, but it carried. The room was that silent. Since 64. Bronx. Dylan nodded. Looked down at his hands. Why didn't you come find me? Didn't want to bother you. You got busy. I understood. I should've. You don't owe me anything, Bob. The words sat in the air between them. Dylan rubbed his face with both hands. When he looked back up, there were tears on his cheeks. I got lost, Dylan said. Not to the audience. To Frank. Everything you said? About the songs not being about me. About staying real. I got lost in all of it. Frank stood up slowly. Age in his movements. He stepped into the aisle. You're still here. That means you can still find your way. Dylan wiped his eyes. Looked at the band waiting behind him. Looked at the audience watching this private conversation happen in public. He stood up, stepped back onto the stage, and picked up his guitar. "I'm gonna play something I haven't played in 15 years, Dylan said to the theater. "A song I wrote when I was 21 years old, and still remembered what mattered." He adjusted the guitar. Looked at Frank one more time. "This is for the man who taught me that the songs aren't mine. They belong to everyone who needs them." Away from the spotlight, Dylan made a choice no one expected. He played Song to Woody, the tribute to Guthrie he'd written in 1961. Raw. Simple. The way he played it in those village basements when nobody knew his name. His voice cracked in places. His fingers weren't as sure as they used to be. It didn't matter. Frank stood in the aisle, hands in his pockets, listening. Tears running down his weathered face. When the song ended, Dylan didn't go back to Tangled Up in Blue. He didn't finish the set list. He looked at his band and said, "I need a minute." He walked off stage. The audience started to applaud, but it died quickly because they could tell something else was happening. Dylan walked down the stage stairs, through the gap in the security barrier, straight to the 7th row. He stood in front of Frank Holloway. "Come have coffee with me after the show," Dylan said quietly. "You sure? You got places to be." "No," Dylan said. "I really don't." What followed stayed with everyone who witnessed it, long after the sound faded. The show resumed 20 minutes later. Dylan came back on stage and played for another hour. But it was different. Looser. More alive. Like something had unlocked. After the show, Dylan and Frank sat in a diner 3 blocks from the theater until 4 in the morning. They drank bad coffee. They talked about Woody. They talked about the railroad. They talked about what it means to spend your life trying to speak for people and wondering if you're saying the right things. "You're still asking the questions," Frank told him. "That means you haven't given up." Dylan went back on tour the next day. But he started playing Song to Woody again. Started playing some of the older songs he'd abandoned. Started remembering why he'd started. 3 years later, Frank Holloway died. Heart attack. Quick. Dylan was on tour in Europe and didn't find out until a week after the funeral. He wrote a song that night. Never recorded it. Never played it publicly. Just wrote it in a hotel room and put it in a notebook. Years later, in an interview, someone asked Dylan about his early influences. He talked about Guthrie. About Pete Seeger. About the Greenwich Village scene. And then, quietly, he said, "There was a man named Frank who taught me that none of this is about me. I forget that sometimes." But he never let me forget for long. The interviewer asked for more details. Dylan shook his head. "Some debts you can't repay. You just have to remember them. Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered." In Dylan's archive, there's a notebook from 1961. On the inside cover, in handwriting that's not Dylan's, are written 2 lines. "The songs aren't about you. They're about the people who can't sing for themselves. F.H." Dylan kept that notebook for over 60 years. On stage in 1978, when he stopped mid-song and stepped back from the microphone, he was remembering who he promised to be before the world decided who he was. Frank Holloway never asked for credit. Never wanted recognition. He was a railroad worker who'd ridden with Woody Guthrie and had one conversation with a 20-year-old kid who'd someday be famous. But in that moment, when Dylan saw him in the 7th row and recognized the face that had given him the only compass he'd ever trusted, everything else fell away. The show. The legend. The voice of a generation. All that mattered was keeping a promise made in a basement cafe 17 years earlier. After Frank died, Dylan requested one thing at the memorial service, that they play Song to Woody. They did. And Dylan sat in the back row silent, remembering the man who'd taught him that stepping back from the microphone is sometimes the bravest thing you can do. The notebook with Frank's handwriting still sits in Dylan's archive. The page is worn from being read. The words haven't faded. Some debts you can't repay. You just have to remember them.